Hello, I'm Scott Wipperman, the pastor here at First Presbyterian Church. And no matter who you are or where you are in your journey of faith, know that you're welcome here. We hope you enjoy today's service on this video, and we invite you to come join us for worship anytime that you would like, or join us in any of the other activities of the church. For more information about First Presbyterian Church, please visit our website at fpchelena.com or call us at 442-4775. God bless. Our gospel reading comes from the Gospel of John, 2nd chapter. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all of them from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build the temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. The word of the Lord. Well, it probably started out well. There were some Sadducees that saw some of the people who had traveled from far up north in Israel, or maybe up from the south, and they had brought their sacrificial animals along with them. But through the long journey, they'd been damaged. And when they came to present them at the temple for sacrifice, they were turned away because the animal was blemished. And you were supposed to bring a blemish-free animal for sacrifice. And they saw the heartbreak on the people that they couldn't offer their sacrifice. And so one of the Sadducees said, "Hey, next year, why don't we bring in some cattle and some sheep and some doves and sell them here in the temple grounds so that people don't have to bring these things when they come from far, where it's so hard to bring in an animal and have it still be unblemished. And we'll sell them at cost. This is a service we're going to do for the people." And it went well for a year or two. But after the second year, a couple of the Sadducees said, "You know, we really are getting tired of cleaning up all this mess from these animals in the temple courtyard. Why don't we hire someone to do it? And we can pay for it just by adding a little bit onto the cost of the animals that we're selling to people who are for sacrifice." And then maybe the next year, after that went pretty well, one of the Sadducees said, "You know, a lot of these people keep bringing this Roman currency in here, and we're supposed to only take temple currency here in the temple. And theologically, I think it's good and sound for us to maintain our purity and accept only temple currency. So why don't we set up an exchange? People bring in their Roman currency, and we'll exchange it for temple currency. Because after all, when we get all that temple currency, all that Roman currency, you know, when our annual shopping spree up to Galilee, we can take it up there and spend it up there." And then maybe the next year, someone brought up that Shepherd Joe over here has some sheep that aren't all white. They're kind of mottled colored. And he says he'll sell them to us really cheap to use for the sacrificial animals. And when God said, "Don't bring a blemished animal for sacrifice," I don't think he meant, you know, pure white, not different colors. Look at you, Sadducee Smith. Your beard is mottled. and you're certainly holy. So we can buy these cheaper sheep from Shepherd Joe, and we'll sell them for sacrifices, because surely being mottled isn't a blemish. And, by the way, we'll make a little bit more money. We'll just charge the same price we've been charging, because people are used to that, what they were paying for sheep. And then maybe a year or so later, it came up, hauling all these Roman coins we get up to Jerusalem is kind of a pain and somewhat dangerous. So I tell you what, why don't we just hire this out? Why don't we hire some money changers to come into the temple, and they can exchange some money, and we'll charge them a tithe on what business they do, kind of thing. And so that went on for a while, but they noticed that these money changers were doing pretty good business. And wouldn't you know that Rabbi Jones came up with this idea to set up a money exchange. And if we have this money exchange, we, as the Sadducees, could do the exchanging in the temple and then get rid of this Roman coinage that we collect through the money exchange and get back more temple currency for that. And we could just keep charging the same exchange rate that those other guys have been doing, because people got used to it, even though it's a pretty high exchange rate. But we'll keep going with that. And then someone brought up a year or so later that, blemish, when God said don't bring a blemished animal to sacrifice, he was meaning don't bring in something that was sick. Certainly we don't want to bring in something that was sick for consumption through a sacrifice. But, a minor scratch or cut or a little bruise here or some spots there, those aren't really blemishes. So we can get some of these animals to sell for sacrifice cheaper if they have a few of these little cuts and scratches and bruises on them, and we can make even more money. So it started out well. There was a concern for the people coming to worship and bringing sacrifice, and the trouble and the difficulty it was of getting there. But over time, it turned more and more and more to be something that oppressed those that were traveling from afar to come to the Passover, and was profiting those that were living there in power in Jerusalem, the Sadducees that were over the temple. And then Jesus comes in. And he sees what's going on, and he drives out the cattle and the sheep. He tells those selling doves to get them out of here. He overturns the money changers' table, scattering their coins all over the place. And the Jews, now you got to remember, in John, whenever he says the Jews, he's referring to Jewish leadership that was in opposition to Jesus. He wasn't referring to all Jews. So these Jewish leaders that were in opposition to Jesus come up to him and say, show us a sign where you have the authority to do this. So something that started out good turned into something that was corrupt and evil, in fact, taking place right there in the temple grounds. Jesus says, you're turning my temple into a market. But was he really concerned about a market? Would he have been okay with the early instantation of this, where they were truly helping out those that were coming to worship by being able to sell some cattle? Or was what Jesus was upset with was the corruption that had set into the system, the oppression of those coming to worship in his house, and those who led the house profiting handsomely off that? Is that what he was objecting to? So Paul tells us, or John tells us here, that the Jewish were looking for signs from Jesus. Paul tells us this as well. He says that the Jews look for signs, the Greeks look for wisdom. But what wisdom is it that they're looking for? Is it God's wisdom? Or is it the worldly wisdom that says, yeah, we got to make a little more profit off of the animals that we sell to people coming to worship? First, we need to seek wisdom. We need to seek God's wisdom. That's what Paul is making clear in what he's talking about. The lectionary texts that we didn't read for today, one came from Exodus, and it's the 10 Commandments, God's laws. And we all remember the short ones. There are 4 short ones. Thou shalt not murder, commit adultery, steal, or bear false witness. The other 6 have a little bit of explanation that goes along with them to help people making sure they fully understand maybe those 6. But those are God's laws, God's guides to us. And the psalmist from Psalm 19 says that these ways of God, these laws, these guides that God gives us will make the simple wise. Is it the case that the worldly wisdom makes the wise simple? That they took what might have been, started out as a very good act in the temple grounds, and when the worldly wisdom crept in, corrupted it, and made it something very evil. So we are to seek God's wisdom. And I think as we seek God's wisdom, we also need to do all we can to resist the encroaching efforts of the worldly wisdom. Things that tell us what is the right thing to do in this world for our benefit. So what does God's wisdom look like? What are God's ways? Well, Paul tells us it's the foolishness of Christ. That's God's wisdom. That's God's way. You know, things like loving your neighbor. Maybe even more so, loving your enemy. Sometimes those two are one and the same. But he goes on to say that we should be praying for those who persecute us, not condemning them, praying for them. And not a prayer of, would you please have a safe fall on the head of, Joe over here. No, a prayer for their benefit, that God will be gracious and bless them. How does that fit with our worldly wisdom? Or Jesus says, like the meek inheriting the world. Now, worldly wisdom doesn't go with that. Worldly wisdom says, when I get hit, I hit back harder. But Jesus says, the meek will inherit the world. Like inviting those, as you're standing next to the target, inviting those who have not sinned to throw a stone at us. Or like being a crippled person, having someone come along and say, stand up and pick up your mat. And you do so. How foolish is that? Someone that's been crippled all their life. Or like believing in eternal life, and that death is not an end. How foolish is that? Life tells us we got to do all we can. While we're here, we got to get our bucket list finished before we go, right? Or telling us not to resist the evil person, but to turn the other cheek. Or like, do not store up your treasures here on earth, when we are all told over and over again that we need to build our IRAs and 401ks up to the max to make sure that we have enough to go forward. And don't worry about tomorrow. Jesus says that. Most of us make a good habit of worrying about tomorrow. We've gotten very good at it. But is that God's wisdom or the world's wisdom encouraging us to worry about something like that? Or how about the foolishness of, like, if I can just touch his hem of his robe, I will be healed? Or the foolishness of following a leader that one gets captured Actually, he surrenders, right? And 2, is tried, and during his trial doesn't object to any of the injustices or lies that are being told about him during this trial. And 3, gets crucified. What kind of idiot would follow someone like that? The foolishness of Christ. That's what Paul is saying is the wisdom of God. That is the power of God. And quite often, that wisdom stands in direct contrast to the worldly wisdom. Quite often, it seems to be completely different. The psalmist says that in adhering to God's ways, there will be great reward. And I don't know, and I don't even think necessarily that this reward is fame or fortune. I think this reward is life. In following God's ways and God's guides, there will be life for us. Because John, the apostle, always talks about light and dark, and when we're not in the light, we are essentially the walking dead. We may be alive, but we're just existing. We're not living. But God's wisdom invites us into the light and into life. And so when we run up against those places where the world's wisdom is the opposite of God's wisdom, which one are we going to choose? Because we have a choice.